Okay, so we're addressing the question, what factors, what particular domestic events, changes in attitude led to the shift from isolationism towards empire, or overseas empire, I should say, by the late 19th century? In other words, why did expansion overseas suddenly gain importance and gain currency as an American foreign policy attitude? Okay, let's address the economic dimensions behind this first. As we now know, the United States is immersed in its industrial revolution at this time. This is known as the Gilded Age. And because we're so good at industrialization, we actually become an economic superpower by this time. But there is a particular state of affairs or condition that, economically speaking, we had now reached by the end of the 1800s. And that's known as economic overproduction. Okay, economic overproduction. And basically, this is a state of affairs whereby too much is produced, right, as industrial output to the point where not all of it can be absorbed domestically by your economy as a country. Okay, so you're making too much, and it can't be consumed. In other words, in terms of supply and demand, there's too much supply because you're good at industrialization, right, and not enough demand. So, what is the solution for this? Well, the perceived solution was the pursuit of overseas markets. Okay, you need to go abroad and sell your products there. So, as I remarked upon earlier, it's going to be the Pacific that will entice American foreign policy makers. That is to say, they're going to look particularly at the Chinese markets. Okay, they're going to look at China as potential markets for American products and thus curing it from this condition known as economic overproduction. Needless to say, during most of the 1800s, there was no need for foreign markets because we're still developing. But we finally reached that threshold, and certainly economic overproduction is a threshold in your domestic economy. Once you reach that, you have to find an external market, and this is exactly the issue that American foreign policymakers have to deal with. Now, another reason has to do less with economics and more with politics and prestige. That is to say, American um, foreign policy elite wanted to be in league with the other great powers of the world at this time. This is similar to Japan, right? As I mentioned, after the Meiji Restoration, they wanted to be recognized as this great empire. So too with the United States. And to be frank, back then, in the 19th century, spilling over to the 20th century, your status, your stature was largely determined, not entirely determined, but largely determined by the extent of your possessions abroad. In other words, the size of your empire. The more colonies you had, the more powerful you were seen, right, as being this dominant empire throughout the world. So the United States felt that it had to compete on the world stage, and therefore, they had to go overseas and gain some colonies. Now, later on, we'll discuss how qualitatively American empire is a bit different from earlier versions of European empire, where they had to go and carve up all of Africa and the Middle East and so on and so forth. It's going to be a little different, whereby we control the economies of other countries rather than you know, um, plant the American flag and encourage Americans to go abroad and settle, these new colonies. So, as you can imagine, we don't really engage in that kind of imperialism and colonialism. But for now, just recognize the fact that we wanted to gain colonies because that, again, elevates your stature for the world. Still, another reason that contributes to the shift towards overseas empire is the fact that the United States was embroiled in so much domestic turmoil at this time. Again, this is the Gilded Age. Yet, even though there's amazing technological and industrial development, right, economic development, at the same time, this causes a host of social dislocation and social problems. For example, you had the populist movement, which was this agrarian revolt against big business and agribusiness. You had the constant class warfare between workers and the industrialist class, right? Capital versus labor, as it's known by historians. And this is really a class war, right? So we're embroiled in this conflict, and American policymakers knew that if we became engaged in overseas imperialism and even conflict, that's to say war, right, with another country or empire, well, that would serve as an outlet for this pressure that was building up domestically. That would serve as a sort of pressure valve, right, to release that tension. In other words, you can imagine this, that domestic focus, which is all that strife that I mentioned, social divisions, and even the talk of revolution was on the lips of many people back then. What's going to happen is there's going to be a refocus from that or away from that towards more nationalism, right, and patriotism. So indeed, that's going to happen once we enter the Spanish-American War. You're going to see people, quote, rally around the flag. You'll see these social divisions, at least temporarily, being dropped because, well, we're now at war. And therefore, this takes precedence, takes priority among most Americans once we're in a war with the Spanish Empire. Okay, so that really explains this movement from isolationism, which again is non intervention in foreign affairs, towards empire, or what's stated as internationalism. And if you notice there on the slide, there's also something stated that, we've been internationalist ever since. Since the late 19th century, U.S. foreign policy has been mostly international in scope. And we see that today. We just withdrew from Afghanistan, the war against Afghanistan, certainly before that, Iraq. This has been really our preoccupation in more current events, the Middle East rather than the Pacific. We're going to see another shift by the end of the 20th